Okay, chapter 12, looking at the Old South, basically looking at what made the South unique pre-Civil War. We're going to look at the dependence on agriculture and slavery, and just kind of overall the slavery institution, also known as the peculiar institution. So first part of it being how diverse was the Old South economy and what was its unifying feature. This region in general was very distinct. Okay, so the South as a distinctive region, went over some of this in class already, but basically talking about how it's going to stay very agricultural based. And because of that, it's going to depend largely on slavery. Expansion west with new states, new land, taking those crops and that labor-intensive way of lifestyle and moving it west is going to just increase the demand for slavery overall. The North and the South interests are going to develop very different. You're going to see sectionalism and regional identification of the economic exports, and their overall policies are going to change and really start to become North and South very, very different. The North is wanting high tariffs on imports to protect their industry, kind of like the American system ideas, and the South is favoring a lot more free trade because they want to import British goods in exchange for cotton without it hurting their economy, which is where a lot of those debates over tariffs and issues come in after that. The kind of the myths that kind of come around this, you have like the whole idea with Gone with the Wind. If you've never seen the movie, it's kind of this romanticized idea of the stable agrarian society. You have the paternalistic planters and this kind of natural way of doing things, and it's a very positive type image. Well, that's not the case. Most plantations don't function that way, and most of the South doesn't function that way. It's a very small percentage of people that actually control the mass amount of slaves. Uncle Tom's Cabin is really going to kind of shed some light on just the overall problems with the slave system, really exposing the truth and the reality to a lot of Northerners, and start to kind of shatter those myths that people had in their head as to what the South was really like. The peculiar institution refers to slavery, and peculiar being that the whole concept of slavery to most people it was odd in the way that they enslaved other people and dehumanized them, and it doesn't end up kind of dying off as they thought it would. In the South really kind of evolved it into something very unique compared to the rest of the world. For religion, the religious aspects that kind of come along with this, you have both the religious backing. People will use religion as support for slavery. Those denominations and preachers that had once spoken out against slavery are going to start to change. Many people within the Baptist and Methodist denominations will begin to accept a lot of slave owners back into their congregations, especially as they move farther west and become a much more dominant force in society. The staple crops with King Cotton. Cotton was a major cash crop. It's going to start to replace tobacco. Tobacco is the first staple crop, and then cotton comes in afterwards. Indigo in South Carolina and rice in the coastal regions, they start to decline, and one of it is you just don't have as much of a demand, and the other part of it is it took a lot of money to maintain those different businesses, whether that was irrigation technology or just the machinery that you would use to manufacture the product or to get it ready for shipment. It became too much to sustain, and so cotton becomes kind of the replacement staple crop and became the most profitable. 1812, we went from, as a country, producing less than 150,000 bales of cotton to over 4 million by the time that we start the Civil War. Three factors that go into that dramatic growth is that you have cotton gins coming in. Eli Whitney, the cotton gin drastically reduced the amount of time it took to produce cotton, to separate the fiber from the rest of the plant, which used to be a very labor-intensive and tedious task. Now it's taking a lot less time. You also have a huge market for it, both in Britain and France, but also in the United States because of the textile boom and needing cotton as the raw materials for the industry growth that you see around the world. More land so that people can expand. low land prices, so people are going to take what money they do have and they can go farther west. They can buy land and plant cotton and start to increase their own personal profits. The cotton belt starts to develop, which is kind of the eastern Carolinas, Georgia through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi River area, and start to see a lot more slave system moving farther west, which is going to gain the attention of the North and cause more problems between the North and the South. Agriculture versus manufacturing. Agriculture, you do have some that are producing corn, wheat, other the more consumable crops, but the South is really going to start to produce a lot more cotton as well. And then you have industry in the North. Some industry starts in the South, but not as much and not nearly the percentages that you're going to see in the North. Some thought that the South was too dependent on the North and needed to increase its own self-sufficiency as a region by developing shipping and imports, exports, to kind of balance that out a little bit more. The North did have a greater balance between the two, especially between consumable agriculture and crops, but also with their industry as well. So the South is definitely lagging behind. It's kind of like they didn't move on. As people start to modernize and industrialize in the North, the South stayed basically to what it knew, what had worked, and didn't really diversify beyond that. The ruling elite are still there. They still have that social hierarchy between the aristocratic planter class that pretty much control everything, to the small farmers or the yeoman farmers, and then slave population at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And so that's kind of very similar to what we saw at that short answer that we did in class with just kind of 1820, you see the slave population, and then by 1860, you can see how it became even more so. This one does reference, this image does talk, has a lot of the Underground Railroad routes, which we'll be talking about a lot more. When slaves are going to fight back against the institution of slavery, the most common way of fighting it was running away. An Underground Railroad is going to be the routes that people would take. Just an FYI, because I've seen this a lot in the past, Underground Railroad does not mean a literal underground subway system of trains running underground. Just an FYI. Just don't do that on a quiz or test, please. So there's a good comparison side by side of the two. And if you want to, especially for this and showing kind of the causes, go back to that short answer question we did in class for your notes on that part. Okay, white society in the South. Overview of this is that, like I mentioned a little earlier, the planter class there's less than 1% who own 50 or more slaves. You had to have more than 20 to be considered a planter, but it's a very small percentage of those who actually own a lot of the slaves. In the South, slavery system is what is supporting and helping the whole cotton industry. And in the South, cotton was king. It was sacred. The slavery institution was sacred. The way of life was very much protected at this point. And the plantations kind of set the tone for everything. Economics, society, everything. Plantations were, the big plantations versus the smaller farms. The plantations were bigger. They had more slaves, more supervision, usually a more comfortable lifestyle, used in a relative sense, because it really was never great, but you were treated more humanely, usually on a bigger plantation that could afford more. If you were living on a poor farm and you might be one of one or two slaves, then that farmer probably could barely afford to buy a slave, let alone to support them and provide them enough food and clothing and shelter for any kind of humane treatment. Less than 4% of the population owned slaves. 25% of the population benefited from slaves. Just in the way that it kind of all came in. 1 in 30 whites in the South were planters, and again, that higher percentage, and they were the elites in the higher social economic class. The small farmers, which I talked about a little bit, they kind of make up the middle class, and the smaller farmers you had where they might be able to own a slave or two. You had the middle class, those that might be the overseers of the plantations and the management system. They might have a few slaves themselves, but for the most part, they are kind of in between, both being either the successful class or the poor whites. The poor whites were very limited. They had the worst land. They had, if they were employed, usually these don't own their own land, so they might work seasonally. So they're also competing for certain jobs where people might not hire slaves, but they might hire a poor white for slaves. That's going to be another reason why many of them are going to still continue to support the institution of slavery, is because they see them as, if they were free, they would be their competition. Honor and violence. This is kind of just the moral code and the way of life in the South. It was very old-fashioned. They had this kind of socioeconomic way of, not socioeconomic, but just kind of overall cultural way of doing things, which was very old-fashioned with the moral codes, loyalty, hunting, riding, gambling. You have dueling is still, a thing with them. Dueling, though, was officially outlawed after the Burr-Hamilton duel in 1804, but the South, it's very rarely enforced, and they still often have many duels. Many prominent leaders were involved in duels, Andrew Jackson being one of them, and over a dozen, Henry Clay, Sam Houston, Jefferson Davis, who comes in as the leader of the Confederacy later. So they just, like I said, they didn't quite move on from the way things had been done. And that's kind of the same image we saw earlier, a little bit on the population density as well. Slave population density, and then you start to see more free black population getting into the years before the Civil War, farther north, and a lot of that came from people who had run away. So slavery in the South, it was one of the fastest growing institutions. 1830, there were more than 2 million, and by 1860, that's over doubled. So about the time that you get into the Civil War, there's about 4 million slaves in the country overall. Before, you had, like, early on, many slaves were treated as indentured servants. Later on, they went to a lifelong inheritance of slavery. Could not legally marry, could be sold at any time, subject to very harsh punishments. In some places, it wasn't considered murder if you beat your slave to death for punishment purposes. Those who were free, it was very uncertain status because it didn't mean social freedom. It just meant, or social equality, it just meant you were literally free from slavery. However, there were a lot of restrictions, a lot of limitations on the kind of jobs that you could have based on being a freed slave. A lot of racial limitations still existed at that point. For slave trade, the international slave trade ends in 1808 as one of the constitutional conditions. But the foreign slave trade is going to continue. The foreign slave trade ends, but the domestic slave trade is going to expand into a largely profitable business. Slave trade across state lines was a major business and a lot of profit to be made, especially as the value of the slave increased as the demand for slavery increased. So that's going to be a major part of it. Is slave trade peaked just before 1837 as they're moving more to the south and to the west. The worst part of it was a lot of times the separation of children from parents, the intentional breaking up of families. Only a couple of states are going to forbid separating a child under 10 from their mother, but before that, it was still officially okay for them to do that. Families and communities are going to develop differently because of that. So it was very much just, whoever is there, you just kind of were adopted into an overall family type of a lifestyle, and they accepted everybody. Most people who, the culture-wise, for this family culture, you have kind of this, combination, because a lot of times, again, if you had separation of families or kids from their parents, then wherever they went to next, they would be welcomed into that community. Marriages in a slave family had no legal status, but were usually generally accepted. Nuclear family was norm, so having a father, mother, children. Childhood was pretty short, though. You were assigned a work assignment and started working around 5 or 6. That would be small tasks, but by the time you were 10, you would be full-time in the fields, in a very tight-knit community type basis. I'll pause here, pick up with part 2 in a minute.